Smart people solve problems, making sense of the chaos of swirling currents. They think outside the box. They are revolutionaries, not intimidated by scale. French chemist and microbiologist Louis Pasteur, a revolutionary thinker, said, "Science knows no country because knowledge belongs to humanity and is the torch which illuminates the world." When it comes to migration, is the European Union thinking outside the box? Is Europe acting in an intelligent and noble way?
La situation dans la Méditerranée est dramatique, il y a une émotion considérable. On sait que le problème n'est pas près de se terminer, que les migrants vont continuer à arriver.
In April, Europe watched as more than 1,000 migrants drowned in the Mediterranean. It was foreseeable, it was predictable, it is a political failure. The European Commission and most EU member states had shipwrecked Europe's humanitarian values, torn between national hostility to migrants and ever-tightening budgets.
We expect all assets as much as possible to be placed in the Mediterranean. We have managed to practically eradicate piracy off the coast of Somalia with funds, with the political will that has been committed by the European Union. Why don't we do the same in the Mediterranean, where the crisis is on our hands?
The International Organization for Migration says that deaths at sea have risen 9 times since the end of Italy's Operation Mare Nostrum. The New York Times reported that early 2015 saw year-on-year a 1,600% increase in the number of migrant drownings. At an emergency summit, Europe's heads of state tripled Operation Triton's budget to €120 million for 2015 to 2016. The European Parliament reacted strongly against what it saw as the Council's weak tragedy response. MEPs proposed a string of measures, including more funding for search and rescue missions, resettlement programs, and quotas to distribute migrants within the EU. But what happens next?
Whilst we can obviously welcome the fact that more assets have been promised to the Triton operation, there's a very crucial point that hasn't been responded to, and that is, what will the operational area of this Triton mission be? Because where the boats and assets are and what type of boats are can still make the difference between life and death.
EU leaders claim tripling Triton's budget would allow for the same operational capabilities as Operation Mare Nostrum had in 2013-2014. It is a soundbite-ready headline.
In 2013, there was Mare Nostrum, an Italian search and rescue operation, which actually saved the life of thousands of people, and which was therefore, could be considered a pull factor, was favorable for refugees and for migrants. And under Mare Nostrum, ironically enough, there were less people coming here than under the much more strict Frontex operations of Triton and Poseidon.
3 harsh realities face Europe. Firstly, Europe needs migrants, but it doesn't like them. Germany's very positive asylum and migration policy looks less altruistic when we consider Germany's declining and ageing population. Quite simply, it's an economic numbers game. It's not really an emotional response, even if the humanitarian outcome is credible.
Europeans counted for approximately 20% of the world population in the 50s, whereas now we are a mere 7%. We need immigration in order to maintain our prosperity. Now, talking about legal migration is controversial and maybe not very popular, but that is what leadership is all about. Leadership is about the courage to take tough decisions. And I welcome the words of Mr. Juncker, who is indeed showing leadership in this respect, and I would wish that the Council would do the same.
There are 3.9 million Syrian refugees in the neighbouring countries of Syria alone. The European Union's pledges on this, with the exception of perhaps Germany and Sweden, have been woefully inadequate. They really need to step up. We also need to see more safe and legal routes into the European territories.
Practically, how do you process hundreds of thousands of migrants coming into Europe?
We should put the figures, I think, in perspective. For instance, in 2014, About 220,000 people arrived here in Europe, migrants and refugees. That may seem like a lot, but on a total of over 500 million people in Europe is actually not such a huge number. So we have well-functioning asylum systems in most of the member states of Europe. If they really relocate the number of people who come here, if they distribute the burden, this should be absolutely no problem to screen it and to process their asylum request in a good way.
Secondly, it's not really Europe's fault that millions of migrants and refugees are fleeing Africa and the Middle East. The nuances of conflicts and military interventions in Libya or failure to intervene in Syria run secondary to the brutality and corruption of Africa's psychotic despots.
Even when they know that the risks are so high, people still board the boats. We've seen women, children, men, brothers, sisters. What does that tell you about the push factors, the sheer desperation and the war and conflict from which they're fleeing?
Europe did not cause this calamity. It is caused by poverty, war, instability, failing states, and a population boom in Africa.
Tant que la situation sera ce qu'elle est en Libye, tant qu'il y aura la Syrie dans l'état où elle est, tant qu'il y aura les événements en Irak, tant qu'on n'aura pas stabilisé là, bien sûr qu'il y a des dizaines de milliers de gens, peut-être davantage, qui vont vouloir venir. Donc l'urgence, c'est de stabiliser cette zone-là.
Let's look at stability in Libya. We need to support and push for the negotiations, both from a political and diplomatic level within the auspices of the UN, where the EU is a leading moderator.
Thirdly, how can Europe integrate millions of migrants into the workforce when EU unemployment is devastatingly high and youth unemployment in southern states burns at 50%? This is why solving the migration crisis takes the genius of Pasteur. Europe must shine a beacon of humanity by dealing with the migration crisis as a science problem, by thinking outside the box and rationalizing the numbers, the scenarios in new ways. Everything has a cost. Invest too little now and we will pay triple later.
It's a moral obligation. If Europe is serious about its human rights protection, about the respect for human life, I think we cannot look the other way and hope the problem is going to go away at some point. It will not. It will in fact come back to us in a larger proportion than it is now if we don't act now.
Solidarity must stop being a slogan. It has to become a reality. This is not about Fortress Europe protecting the borders. This is about more capacities for search and rescue.
A fortress should be a place of protection, not isolation. Here in Brussels, this asylum centre is where many migrants come. Some will be sent back to the country of origin, others will receive asylum. But in the 21st century, should a fortress be a place of protection or of isolation? Fortress Europe has to decide.
There's a very high cost of Fortress Europe, a human cost to Fortress Europe. The constant emphasis on clamping down borders, on using the security-based only approach rather than a human rights-based approach to migration has really had very dramatic consequences.
Maximilien Robespierre said, "To punish the oppressors of humanity is clemency, to forgive them is cruelty." Europe needs to actively punish Africa's oppressors. This must be part of the strategy to stop the push factors. Europe's global presence will demand a military response to humanitarian crisis, perhaps under the banner of United Nations, perhaps in support of the African Union. But what is clear, Europe already has the capacity to launch an immediate humanitarian response under an EU flag. Though it has never been used and is not yet openly discussed at the European Council, Europe already has provision for the immediate deployment of 2 European battle groups.
Il n'est pas nécessaire d'avoir une intervention militaire. Ce qui est important, c'est de coordonner les actions à la fois de l'Union européenne, de l'Union africaine et des Nations unies. C'est la conjonction de ces 3 éléments qui doit en tout cas aider dans un premier temps à stabiliser la Libye.
A military answer to a humanitarian problem, we're not sure what that's going to solve it. On the contrary, what's needed is more means. It's really an openness to welcome refugees in Europe. And it's not going to be a matter of invading a country or bombing certain smuggling boats. We think that will be a very delicate, very dangerous exercise as well.
Liberal group leader Guy Verhofstadt said the battle groups are little more than a list in Mogherini's desk, and he is right. to a point. With the consent of the Council, 5,000 personnel and equipment are, in theory, ready to be assigned to the field. Their missions are guided by the Petersberg tasks, and top of that list is humanitarian missions. If Jean-Claude Juncker is ever to realise the European army, it will not start with a military invasion, it will start with humanitarian action. Before that happens, maybe some rebranding is needed. A European task force is certainly more politically acceptable than the warlike European battle group.
We need to see what we can do in order to ensure that the development aid that we agree on in this House and with the Council actually goes towards empowering the African countries in order for persons to stop fleeing war, to stop fleeing violence and persecution. These people are desperate. We need to give them solutions. We need to help them.
We really have to start thinking out of the box and offer a decent, legal and safe way for people to come here so that there is no need anymore for them to really go via smuggling routes and a very deadly sea route of the Mediterranean.
We could do this through resettlement, of course, through humanitarian visas, and also by a more liberal look at family reunification, because even under the Dublin regulations as it stands now, you could look to say that when someone arrives, do they have extended family in another country, or do they have more community links? So we need to look at broader solutions to this problem.
We cannot shed tears unless we cry selfishly for our own failings. Albert Einstein remarked, we cannot despair of humanity since we ourselves are human beings. It is time to act. In helping our neighbours, we are helping ourselves.